Hey everyone, today I wanted to talk about a growing issue in Dead by Daylight that has been particularly prevalent across the last few months, but also something that has spanned a bit before that as well, and this is largely to do with queue times. It's something that's particularly prevalent in the current version of 2v8, where they've just added Oni and the Ghostface. And I did talk about this a bit before with the last version of 2v8, and things haven't really changed all too much since then, admittedly. The issue there before was that the killer side was getting a lot more than the survivor side, I think, when looking at 2v8. And in my opinion, this is largely what causes the imbalance in the queue times, is because Killer has a lot more getting added, they have a lot more new to engage with, whereas Survivor really doesn't. I do think they've tried to combat this slightly this time around by adding the new Void Crystals into chests for Survivor, but these realistically are not nearly enough to balance out two new killers being added, let alone two new killers who are incredibly well loved. I also think it's a bit of a shame because Survivor almost lost something this time too, because the Resident Evil base mode herbs didn't return. This was actually a pretty cool mechanic, not quite enough I think to make Survivor as engaging as the killer side, but I do think it was a step in the right direction. And I feel the same way with the Void Crystals. This imbalance is something that I do think is spanning outside of 2v8 a bit though as well, and particularly due to the number of popular releases we've had recently. Kaneki was seemingly one of the best releases Dead by Daylight has ever had. I think they even said in the PAX stream it is one of the best they've ever had. The player numbers for Kaneki were insane. I mean, he was appearing all the time, he seemed very popular, he still appears a lot now, his pick rate was through the roof. And what's a little scary, to be honest, is that FNAF and Springtrap are coming next, and undoubtedly the pick rates for Springtrap are going to be incredibly high as well. There's going to be no getting around that. And what doesn't help this either is that the FNAF chapter doesn't have a survivor, so this should realistically cause the killer queues to simply get even longer even in 1v4. I will mention before I go into what I think would be good solutions and what I think are the problems really here as well, I do want to say that they have already mentioned they're planning a new system for the next version of 2v8, which is going to allow you to queue as survivor whilst you wait for a killer game. And this does seem like a very good idea and a very good addition. This would surely help the killer queues, I think. Also, as I mentioned, they are clearly adding new things into the survivor gameplay, which is going to make them more engaging too. Things such as the Void Crystals and the herbs last time for Resident Evil. These things are genuinely good additions. I don't want to just glaze over these and pretend like they're not doing anything to address survivor, because I think they absolutely have. I equally just think that it's a much larger issue and survivor needs a lot more. I think the issue at the core of all of this as well is that the things they're releasing are simply too fun, which is a really nice issue to have, I suppose, isn't it? You've created something that's just that fun that everyone wants to play it, and so it's imbalancing the sides. I think that's a nice problem to have, realistically, isn't it? It's a lot better than having sort of a negative problem. However, it is definitely still causing a problem more widely in the game due to the queue times being imbalanced, or I suppose just the population of players on either side. Kaneki was incredibly popular, and it's largely because I think he's incredibly fun. He's got a dash-based power which people generally really love, he can move around the map in a really dynamic way, and he was also very strong on release, which I'm sure helped him to become more popular as well. 2v8 has basically always been popular for the killer side because it's such a fresh and new experience for killer, and it's been one of those things people have always talked about in terms of a new or second game mode. 2v8 was like the FNAF of game modes, if that makes sense. Everyone wanted this game mode for so long, and now it's here. Everyone really enjoys it, even after each iteration it releases. It actually only gets more fun, I would argue, because each time they add new killers to it. This adds sort of a nice scarcity, but also sort of feeling of anticipation each time, because each time you're waiting for a new killer to be added, but then having the sort of scarcity of the reduced roster to begin with makes it so you enjoy those characters, and so when more get added, you can sort of, move on and engage with those a bit more. It's a really good system, especially because the killer powers are being being updated and changed and generally buffed for 2v8, which makes a lot of these characters a lot more fun in some cases. Or at the very least, it gives them all a bit of a power fantasy. On the Survivor side, however, this just doesn't really happen, and I would actually debate the gameplay is almost regressed back from what it is in 1v4, I would say is the issue. Obviously, survivors in 1v4 don't have a core ability or anything like that. They mainly rely on perks for their quote-unquote ability, or an add-on really, is technically their power slot. So it's a very different experience, but obviously there's 4 of you, which is what balances that out. However, variety on Survivor has generally always come from your perk usage, I would say. And so in 2v8, when they've exchanged all of your perks for these very narrow classes, I would say, it doesn't quite work, I think. Again, for killers, this isn't so much of an issue because they have their power and they have it buffed up, again, generally speaking, not in all cases, but their power is changed in some way, which already gives them a lot to interact with, and they also get these new abilities, which is quite cool. They're also getting drip-fed new content each time due to new killers releasing each time. The Survivor side, on the other hand, has had very little added to it. I think there's been a couple new classes added, and then the Void Crystals, and obviously the herbs, but those were restricted only to the Resident Evil mode. So they've really not had all too much, and it's not a case where you can sort of drip feed them the perks, because instead of perks we have these abilities and classes which don't quite work in the same way. And even if there were a new class each time, I don't think it would quite live up to the same hype as adding a new killer, or 2 new killers. And I think if 2v8 is going to be a long-staying game mode, I think it really needs to fix this. And I think it is the plan to keep 2v8 around for a long time, to keep it coming back and back, even when the roster is completed on the killer side, to keep it going, which I would absolutely love, by the way. But currently, in this iteration specifically, queue times have gotten excessively long, I think. I've not been timing them directly, but it's felt like about a 30-minute wait, I think, for the most part. I have heard other cases of people waiting 40-45 minutes. So here's my suggestions for what to do on the Survivor side to make it slightly more improved. For one, I honestly think they need to allow survivors in some capacity to access perks, because I think already perks are the sort of a power equivalent of killers. Survivor without perks, I think, is a lot less interesting. So my suggestion is you give a subset or pool of perks based on which class you pick. So you pick a certain class, and then when you've selected that class, you get a pool of perks to choose from. This means the new class system is sort of reinforced still, but you also get to engage with perks and their unique gameplay too. So say you pick the healer class, you get the base healer abilities, but then you can also select 4 healing base perks or support base perks. If you pick the running base class, then you get perks that are made for looping. If you pick a class that's more deceptive based, you get, again, deception based perks. If you pick a class that's maybe more disruptive, you get perks like head on or any means necessary, things like that. And by restricting it to a smaller pool of perks too, you could also give out these perks for free and actually give a reason for people to engage with Survivor, because they may not have these perks, but it means if they play them in 2v8, if they play this set class, they get to play around with some new perks too. This maybe doesn't help sort of longer term players so much, but for newer players, I think it would. It would actually encourage them, I think, to be like, oh, well, I don't know what the perk does and I want to try it out, let me play that class. The other thing I think they need is something a bit more and a bit similar to the Void Crystals. And I do like how they've done this. They've made it so it's sort of this rare item drop in chests. I just think at the moment, not enough people are sort of aware of them, I would say. I would really like if they added a mechanic kind of similar to Vecna's magical chests. If they scattered various chests around the map that look different and maybe a bit more exciting, and you could also open them far quicker, and they had a sort of scaling rarity system with various things inside, I think that'd be a lot more engaging for survivors, especially if there were new abilities with these items. Some things I thought of were, again, the Void Crystals could be in there. There could be some kind of insta-heal syringe-like item. They could have similar items to Vecna's eye and Vecna's hand that allow sort of invisibility effects or various things like that. Again, make some of these quite rare, by the way. I'm not advocating for all 8 survivors having these. I think at the moment the imbalance largely comes from the lack of sort of fun, I think, in some ways that the survivors get to do. I think they need more of a sort of sandbox to play around in. Again, because they don't have their perks, which is sort of the survivor sandbox, I would say, that and their items. So the fact that you can't bring an item into the trial and you're reduced down to these classes, I think just makes it simply less fun. So I do think making it a bit more sandboxy, adding these fun items around everywhere that people will want to go and pick up and interact with and simply just play around with, allowing them to have perks and allow them to have interactions and sort of choose what they want to bring in more, I think would make Survivor a lot more engaging too. I worry at the moment that it's almost the case that survivors are just there for the killers to have fun with, if that makes sense. That's sort of what it feels like sometimes. The killers have so many fun things to do, again, buffed up powers, but then the survivors feel sort of narrowed down. So it feels like this case where the killer gameplay is sort of being favored or it's being uplifted, but then the survivor gameplay is actually being drawn back a bit. So that's my main ideas for 2v8. And I don't think these are going to be perfect, and I think ultimately, even if you added so much stuff to survive and you did all of this, I think the queue times are still going to be really long. I think ultimately there is no way to fix the queue times to make them the same for each side or make them even like a minute or two. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think, you know, props to them if they find a way and they find a good system, but I think it's going to be incredibly hard, so I don't envy them at all for that. They've made a game mode that's just way too fun, basically. The other thing people mention a lot is just adding a huge BP bonus, and whilst I do think this is a nice idea, I actually really don't think it's going to work. I do think it would help a little bit, and I do think it would reduce queue times, but I don't think it's going to be as effective as lots of people think, because lots of people in the case of 2v8 I think are doing it more for the fun. They're not going into the mode wanting to optimize BP or earn BP, or that they're not playing it to grind. I think they're playing it to enjoy it in this case. Whereas the main 1v4, you know, they might be more concerned with, oh, well, I do want to have fun, but I also want to get some blood points because I want to level up my character. They're more focused, I think, in terms of 2v8 on simply playing the game and the interacting with the gameplay. But hey, I do think whacking 1000% BP on Survivor would probably do something too. So moving on to now the 1v4 and sort of some concerns I have for the FNAF chapter, which is simply that it's probably going to be another huge imbalance in queue times, with Springtrap being incredibly popular and the survivors once again not necessarily getting much in this chapter, largely because there is no new survivor. Now granted, generally speaking, even when a survivor and a killer is added, the killer is typically favored because obviously they have a power, they have perks, they have all their add-ons, they have more just generally speaking, right? Whereas the survivor just gets 3 perks and, you know, there's not a new item added, there's nothing like that. So a survivor realistically is a skin and 3 perks. But I do think having a survivor in this chapter would have at least balanced that out. But again, I completely understand if it wasn't the way to go about it, you know, I get it. I don't think that's an issue. I'm not trying to say they should have done it just to make the queue times better. They definitely shouldn't have. However, it is going to be quite interesting, I think, to see what they're going to do with this, whether they're going to implement a system where, similar to the 2v8 system they've mentioned, where you can maybe queue up for a Springtrap game, or just a killer game in general, probably, because obviously Springtrap's going to affect all killer queues, where you can queue up for a killer game and then maybe play a couple survivor games, and then after a couple you get placed into your killer game. But then the other concern for this, and also for 2v8, is are people going to be engaging with the survivor gameplay as, I don't know, as intently, I suppose, as they would be if they were just choosing to play survivor? If they're queuing for a survivor game sort of out of necessity to find their killer game eventually, are they going to be engaging and playing in the same way they would be if they had chosen to queue for survivor? I think probably not. And again, one of the big issues we have at the moment with the sort of go next thing could also just become more prevalent debatably with this. Again, I don't want to jump to that conclusion. That does seem like a bit of a wild jump at this point before we've seen it, but I do think it's something to sort of keep in mind. So if the case here is to make something in regular 1v4 survivor gameplay more engaging, what exactly could this be? Now, there was a few trials recently with things like the blood cans, and I do think these helped a lot. I do think this was a nice addition, and for me at least, playing Survivor, I played quite a bit of Survivor. I'm probably a bit more Survivor leaning. I'm probably about a 60-40 to Survivor. For me, these did really help me. It made me enjoy the mode more, and it made me engage with the gameplay because it was a cool new mechanic. I wanted to do the blood gens because I thought it was a cool new thing to engage with. I don't necessarily think the blood gens were quite there yet functionally, but as a new idea for a mechanic and as a test, I think it was a huge success. And I really applaud them for doing it, even if, you know, there were a lot of issues with the sort of the new system. You know, some perks didn't work with the blood gens, there were things like that. Again, I get it, it's a little frustrating, but I think overall that sort of thing needs to be applauded. I think it's good that they're doing that, they're thinking of these things, they're even testing them out in sort of a new event mode. I think that's pretty cool. They also announced they are adding a new survivor item to the game, and whether this is going to be the void crystals in the main game is, you know, maybe questionable, but I do think this kind of mechanic could work really well as well. Having void crystals or some kind of other special item that you can find by searching a chest, I think is a really great idea. A rare item inside of a chest that you can only get by searching chests. This adds almost like a fun secondary treasure hunt or objective into the game. Maybe add more things aside just the void crystal as well, but I do think adding that is a really great start. I think it's just about variety and variation and just something that's a bit new and fresh for the Survivor side. Whilst it's always nice to get new perks and stuff like that, they are also still just perks, and with a huge pool of them already, I do feel like it sometimes gets a bit less exciting each time, even when something pretty cool is added. All of these things never quite shape up, I think, to a new killer power, and again, as I've mentioned, I know it's like a natural imbalance, and it probably can never be the same thing where a new Survivor is as exciting as a new killer. I just simply think that's usually not going to happen. I'd really like to hear your ideas on this too, and yeah, I'm interested to see what everyone thinks. Personally, this has been something I've seen just rising and rising, and I do think it's a real problem that could be pretty bad for the game. Again, it's not like dreadful, I think, and I think the things they have in place and the things they have planned are going to aid this very well, but I do think it's a little concerning, and that's what I want this to come off as, this video. I want it to be a video of concern. This is a problem I would argue is being created by the gameplay being too fun in some areas, which, as I said, is a good problem to have, isn't it? I think overall this is a problem born of something positive, and for that reason I do think it's questionable to call it a problem, but I do think it's in some ways is one too. But I do want this video to come off as, you know, concern rather than it being sort of ranty or angry. That's definitely not my intention. So yeah, I do hope you enjoyed. Please let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.